I think we're ready to start. Just want to let everybody know that this is recorded, and we will get the recording. I will be sending it out. We will be sending it out to everyone after the meeting with the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint, unfortunately, I apologize, cannot be shared this morning because of our technical difficulties, but it will be shared with everyone with additional information that was sent to us.
Thank you, Lily. Thanks so much, and thanks for helping with all the technical issues. I can hear you all fine. I got to hear about the weather in Newfoundland, Beth. That sounds like we're sending you some of our freezing rain. Here in Nova Scotia, it was described like the weather conditions are like a glazed donut with sprinkles. So I think that's the freezing rain with the ice pellets on top of it. So just imagine that. So happy New Year and good afternoon, senators and staff and our special guests. Welcome to our first in our climate speakers series for 2022. Just wonderful to see you all here. Bonne année et bon après-midi.
Happy New Year. Good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome.
To be speaking with you today from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq people. Senators for Climate Solutions is pleased to welcome you all to this important session on lessons learned from Canada's record on climate change with Mr. Jerry DeMarco, Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development. We're also very happy to be able to offer the following events over the next couple of months. On February 23rd, we will have Catherine Hayhoe, author of Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. On March 30th, we have lined up Mark Carney, United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. And Senator Kuchar and I are also very happy to inform you that we've confirmed a session on March 24th with Stephen Guilbeault, Minister of Environment and Climate Change. As you know, Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan is due by the end of March, and that event will be very timely. So we're looking forward to all of those three. But now let's get right back to today's distinguished guest. This afternoon, Mr. DeMarco will be speaking and making a presentation for approximately 20 minutes. Interpretation is provided and works in the same way it does during our Senate sittings. After Mr. DeMarco's presentation, Senator Kuchar will moderate a question and answer period, and we will be recording the session as Lily said. So colleagues, today we are very fortunate to have with us Mr. Jerry DeMarco, who is joined by his colleagues Kimberly Leach, James McKenzie, and Elsa Da Costa. Mr. DeMarco assumed the role of Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development in the Office of the Auditor General of Canada in February 2021, so a year ago. A lifelong interest in nature and a 25-year career devoted to working in the environmental field have positioned Mr. DeMarco as a leading Canadian expert in environmental policy and law. Before joining the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, Mr. DeMarco served as Commissioner of the Environment and Assistant Auditor General at the Office of the Auditor General of Ontario. That was from 2019 to 2021, just before he came to us. Mr. DeMarco is a member of the Law Society of Ontario, a registered professional planner, and a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners. Mr. DeMarco, thanks to you and your colleagues for being with us today. Over to you. We're all ears. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Senator Coyle. And a big thank you from our office, the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, which is situated in the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We're very happy to have been invited to speak to you today about two of our recent reports. We'll be focusing on the climate change report, but we'll also, as requested, touch on the Emissions Reduction Fund report. And thank you to whomever is managing the slides for me. It's always a good idea to have someone other than myself doing that, so it goes very smoothly. So if that person could just move to the next slide, we'll go right into the meat of the presentation. We'll get through that and then leave lots of time for questions for me or my colleagues that you may have. So Just a little bit of an overview, just in case you are not familiar with our office, and in particular our mandate regarding environment and sustainable development. This is my first time meeting almost all of you, I believe. So just a little bit of an introduction to what we do. So back in 1995, almost 30 years ago, the Auditor General's office received a new mandate relating to the environment, sustainable development, and the creation under the legislation of a new position, the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, something I've been doing now for a year and 2 or 3 days, as Senator Coyle just mentioned. And very early on, the initial commissioner and the staff of the office took an interest in climate change and put together reports touching on the issue or focusing on the issue over the years. And you can see on the left side of the screen some of the reports that came out in those early years, several that focused on the Kyoto targets and plans, energy efficiency, and so on. And then in the last 10 or 11 years, the volume of our work that focuses on climate-related issues has gone up considerably, and will do so again this year in terms of many of the topics listed in this box on the right-hand side of your screen. So those are just some of the issues that we've touched on over the last 11 years, or in the case of the bottom half of the right side of that box, ones that we are working on for tabling this year. So carbon pricing, just transition, climate resilient infrastructure, hydrogen, and some research rather than an audit on climate risk disclosure. So those ones are all slated for release this spring and this fall. So quite a lot on the go from our office on the issue of climate change. We could proceed to the next slide. So the report that you asked me to focus on today is our lessons learned report. And so that came out in November. And it's unusual for our office. It's not a performance audit. It's essentially a historical perspective on Canada's action to address climate change. And as the graph that you can see on the cover of our report, the graph is covering 3 decades of Canadian action and, unfortunately, Canadian inaction on climate change. We chose to look back as a retrospective, but also try to add value looking forward. And in doing so, we focused on what lessons could we be learning from the past. What could we draw on from our past audit reports, of which there are many? What could we learn from previous commissioners that we spoke to? What could we learn from senior government officials, past and present, and experts in the field? And after doing that research in the form of reviewing our past audit work and doing all of these interviews, we narrowed it down to 8 lessons learned. There's nothing magic about 8. That was just the taxonomy that we chose to use. Some of the lessons have some sub-issues in them, and we could have had 10 or 11 or whatever, but we distilled it down to these 8 lessons learned. And for the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on 1 slide per lesson, and we'll go through those now. Before doing that, just wanted to remind everyone something that you all know, of course, and the people on this call are representing regions all across Canada. This slide, which I'm not going to go through in detail because you'll be provided with a copy of this PowerPoint file after the presentation today, just highlights some of the different types of effects climate change is already having and the risks for further severe weather events and so on in Canada. So, you know, we're talking about reduced ice cover and melting permafrost in the far north, intense rainfall as we've experienced in BC and in the East Coast in the past year, more frequent heat waves. You're all quite aware of these, but Canada being such a large country, we seem to be getting some of all of these types of impacts, and in some places, like BC this year, getting more than one of these types of impacts in quick succession in terms of heat, fire, and then flooding, all in a relatively short period of time. So they're posing risks, but the risks have actually been taking place, have been actualized in recent in the recent past, Canada and around the world. So the next slide sets a little bit of the stage for the lessons learned. And that's the same graph as on the cover of our report. And it's not a good news story, as you know. Canada in the late 80s, hosting the Toronto Conference on the atmosphere, and then taking a leadership role in 1992 with the Rio Conference in encouraging industrialized nations to sign on to the various conventions and agreements that were adopted in Rio. We were a leader back then, no doubt, in terms of getting this agenda on the map.
No, I just had a sound.
Okay.
Him.
Okay.
No.
So I think someone doesn't realize that their mic is
No,
on.
I had it on toast.
Could people please mute their mics other than Ms.
So thank you, Senator Coyle. So as I say, in terms of bringing this agenda to the fore and encouraging other industrialized nations to take the issue seriously in the late 80s and early 90s, Canada was a leader. In terms of actual on-the-ground results, or one might say in the atmosphere results, not a good news story. Canada's repeated commitments to first stabilize and then decrease greenhouse gas emissions, those targets and plans that would result in a curve going down and to the right on the screen in front of you. Instead, we have the curve going up to the right. So we're not just failing to meet our targets, but we're going in the opposite direction. We've been on the up escalator of emissions for the last 30 years, when we should be on the down escalator of emissions, as per our commitments and as per worldwide agreement, global agreements under the rubric of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So there's a lot to do. We've got a lot of catching up to do. To put it in perspective, if we were to put Canada's current target for 2030 on that graph, and just extend the graph over a little to the right, it would be right below the cutoff mark. It would be in the 400s in terms of megatons. We're up in the 700s. So a huge amount of work to do, partly because we were going in the wrong direction for so many years. Okay, next slide. We'll start to get into the lessons. Might have skipped one there. It should be a lesson one. Maybe it's not. I'll just speak to lesson number one, because it's on my screen, but it's not on the shared screen for some reason. So lesson one is an important one, and we'll be getting to lesson two in a second, which is on the shared screen. Lesson one is about strong leadership and coordination that's needed to drive progress towards climate commitments. So as you know, climate change knows no borders, and addressing climate change requires leadership and coordination among all levels of government within Canada, local, Indigenous, provincial, territorial, federal, and then across the globe in terms of all of the countries participating in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So leadership is key, and the lesson that we've put in our report is, how can we better ensure that the federal government's lead departments on these issues are given the resources and the authority they need to provide the leadership and translate commitments into actions. And as well, in terms of leadership, the providing leadership on depolarizing the debate in a forum like today with senators from all across Canada, looking at the issue in a nonpartisan way and coming together to focus on solutions rather than further polarizing the debate. So excellent work by those who have led the development of this group in terms of providing bridges across the regions of Canada as we work together in addressing the climate crisis. So leadership is lesson number one, the slide that was missing off the screen. Lesson number two, which is on your screen right now, is something that's been the focus of some of our committee hearings before the House this week, and that is the Canadian economy is still very dependent on emission-intensive sectors. It's no surprise. It's not something that we haven't been aware of, but we have not really addressed the fact that the world is moving towards a less carbon intensive future, and Canada, with its vast array of natural resources, renewable and non-renewable, Canada has to get on board with that transition, that just transition away from too much dependence on emission-intensive sectors and more dependence on less intensive emission sectors. So that issue of the nature of our economy and the challenges that poses to Canada and to particular regions of Canada whose economies are based on emission-intensive sectors and who need to be provided with a just transition to a net zero future for Canada. So lesson number 2. So we'll move on to lesson number 3 now, and hopefully that will show. Oh, there we go. There's lesson number 1. It was just out of order. So now is lesson 3. So that's good that you do have the lesson number 1 slide for future reference. Just some reason they got jumbled on the screen here. So lesson number 3, climate adaptation. We have to prioritize that, not at the expense of mitigation. We need to work on both, of course, but we need to, unfortunately, because of the lack of adequate mitigation around the world for the last 30 years, adaptation is a reality. And we touched on that on the map of Canada slide, droughts, floods, heat waves, wildfires, storms, melting permafrost, and so on. We're going to be working on adaptation alongside mitigation for the rest of our lives because of the longstanding impacts that climate change has and the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Some considerations for parliamentarians, and I should mention that this lessons learned report is directed to parliamentarians. So we have provided you with questions that you may ask in the Senate or at committee or in other fora, where you can pose these questions or other questions that you deem fit to government officials and stakeholders about how can we get past some of these hurdles that have prevented real progress for the past 30 years. So these considerations for parliamentarians, which I'm touching on for each lesson, there's 3, 4, or 5 of them for each lesson in the full report, and they're all replicated on these slides. An example for this one: how can the federal government better integrate local and community level insights into federal adaptive planning and action? Extreme weather and more frequent extreme weather is felt at the local level, and community level insights, they're the ones that are closest to the ground and how climate change is impacting them in terms of their lived experience. So that's lesson number 3, adaptation. Lesson number 4, they're in order still. So this is looking more at the economic side. Climate change doesn't just threaten the environment, it also has a big impact in the financial markets and on our economy in general. We could be left behind if we don't quickly get on board with the reorientation of climate finance and the reorientation of our economy. And it sounded from the introduction to the talk today that you will be having Mr. Carney come in and likely speaking about this issue. So I won't go into it in detail because you have an expert coming on this very subject, but it's obviously a key issue, something that is touched on in the new Net Zero Act in terms of the Minister of Finance's new requirement to report on risks and opportunities relating to the climate, and is also touched on in the recent mandate letters to the Minister of Finance and to the Minister of Environment regarding moving towards mandatory climate risk disclosures and requiring federal organizations to report on this important issue. So that's lesson number 4. Lesson number 5, which is the next slide, increasing public awareness. So one of the reasons I have some optimism about this file compared to, I hate to call it a file because it's the health of our planet, was one of the reasons I have some optimism about making some actual progress on climate is that public awareness is much, much higher than back in 88 when Canada hosted the conference on it, back in 1990 when Canada did the Green Plan and committed to addressing climate, or 1992 when the Rio conference happened. Public awareness could still be improved, and that's what this lesson is about. But it has been improving steadily for quite some time now. And I suspect as we make further progress in getting through COVID, we will be seeing climate, being part of the public discourse even more again, as it was just before COVID. Not to say that it's gone silent in that time, but obviously the COVID issue has been top of mind for all of us for quite some time now. So increasing public awareness of the climate challenge is important, and it's related to one of the lessons learned in the first lesson learned in terms of leadership and depolarization of the issue. The more the public understands the climate challenge, the more support there will be for government and individual behavior actions that will support the transition to a more climate-friendly future and a net zero emissions future for Canada. So public awareness is the fifth lesson. The sixth lesson, and I'm not sure if this is a lesson or just a description of what's happened for the past 30 years. It's the bad news story. I mean, we've had no shortage of climate targets, no shortage of plans, and no shortage of international agreements on this issue. But in Canada especially, the emissions have gone up. This is a reorientation of the same graph that was presented on an earlier slide. As time goes up, as you move up the y-axis of that graph, emissions are going up on the x-axis of that reoriented graph, which is a part of an infographic that's available on our website to help explain Canada's track record. So climate targets, they haven't been backed by strong plans and action. So we need plans that actually work. Ostensibly, each plan that we've put out as a country adds up, or appears to add up on paper, that it'll help meet a target, but the actual contents of them haven't been sufficient to meet those targets. And most importantly, even where they do add up, the implementation of the actions has not occurred to the degree necessary to not only meet the targets, but in our case, we've gone the opposite direction, as I've alluded to a few times now, in terms of net GHG emissions in Canada for the past 30 years, and that 20% rise from 1990 to 2019, which is the latest year for which we have data. So that's lesson number 6, following up the targets with strong actions. It's a simple lesson, but it's one that has not been learned yet in Canada, unfortunately. Lesson number 7, and that's enhanced collaboration by bringing all actors together for finding climate solutions. This meeting is an example of that. I'm happy to participate in your discussions of this new working group focused on climate issues at the Senate. So enhanced collaboration among all actors is needed to find these solutions. And, that's across government, across levels of government, across international boundaries, including Indigenous communities, including local communities. And as I mentioned before, provincial, territorial government, civil society, and so on, and an increasing role for the private sector in general, of course, but in terms of the financial subsector of the private sector, everyone is going to have to work together in a whole of society approach to tackle essentially the globe's biggest challenge, which is climate change. Lesson 8 is a difficult lesson for governments to address. There are a lot of incentives for short-term thinking within government, and climate change as a crisis, biodiversity loss as a crisis, various elements of sustainable development, equity, poverty, and so on. Many of these are intergenerational crises. And governments and the private sector, for that matter, tend to discount the future and focus on more near-term results, although even focusing on near-term results in terms of our climate targets has not borne fruit in Canada. But what we want to focus on here is how can the federal government be held to account and manage for addressing long-term issues like climate change our structures are not well set up to look, let alone one generation into the future, or even multiple generations into the future. But if we don't do that, we're essentially breaching our intergenerational trust to future generations, to our children, to our children's children, who are not able, the unborn are not able to stand up for themselves as to the legacy that the current generation and the recent past generations are leaving for them. So we have an obligation, in accord with the principle of intergenerational equity, we have an obligation to better address these long-term issues, such as climate change or biodiversity loss. And as the last bullet point notes in the consideration for parliamentarians, how can we even better address that with today's youth? We can't speak to future generations because they're not with us here, but the closest we have to future generations are our younger generation. And how can we better involve them? You see around the world that they're looking for opportunities to voice their concerns. We have to learn how to incorporate those concerns in light of our past failures in terms of this intergenerational crisis of climate change and the related crisis of biodiversity and all of those related to the larger sustainable development agenda, including our ability to address the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is an intergenerational problem, and we're going to need structures and decision-making processes that take that into account rather than discounting the future. So those are the 8 lessons learned. And I'm going to now just zip through the last slide. And because you did want me to touch on one of our other reports, which is a typical product of ours, a performance audit report. That was the Emissions Reduction Fund managed by Natural Resources Canada as a COVID measure, and it was attempting to reduce harmful methane emissions while maintaining employment in the sector. And we focused on whether Natural Resources Canada designed and implemented a program to achieve value for money and to ensure credible and sustainable reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So rather than getting into the details of that, you can feel free to pose questions about it, because I don't want to spend too much more time in presentation mode, because I do want to be able to answer your questions. So if we could then just move along to the slide 17. Yep, you're ahead of me on that one. You had it there. The Net Zero Act. We have a new mandate. It's in June of 2021. We were given a mandate in addition to our mandates under the Auditor General Act and the Federal Sustainable Development Act. We're going to be examining and reporting on the government's measures aimed at climate change at least once every 5 years, more likely more frequently than that. So that's what's coming. We're looking at our options for discharging that new mandate in the field of climate change under the Net Zero Act. So the final slide is the Thank You MEFC slide, and an invitation to whomever will be facilitating the question and answer session to take over from me and to manage the questions as they come up. I look forward to helping to answer them along with our team here, who was introduced at the beginning of the call.
Well, Senator Kucha here. Thank you so much, Mr. DeMarco. That was timely and highly informative, and very, very appreciative. We are indeed fortunate to have you and your team doing this incredible work, not only pointing the way, but helping us realize, as you said, that we've had more failures than successes in this file, and that can't continue. So I have Senator McPhedran and then Senator Galvez in that order for questions. I have about 26 of them myself, but if people could just raise their hand and also show me in the chat. Is that Senator Griffin? Is that your hand up as well? Yeah. Okay. So we'll go Senator McPhedran, Senator Galvez, and then Senator Griffin.
And Senator Marshall. It's
Oh, it
actually
didn't seem
Senator
as.
Marshall that has the hand up.
Oh my gosh. There's something.
I know we look alike.
The same height.
Yes, you caught it.
Okay. I apologize. So it'll be Senator Marshall. Oh, there's a problem with the hand. Okay, got it. Okay, so those are the three. Can you put your names in the chat as well? Because clearly I've already failed in doing this. All right, Mary Lou.
Thanks very much. And thank you, Mr. DeMarco, to you and your team, and also to my colleagues for organizing this. I was captured by your reference to youth engagement and the strong need for more of that. I wanted to share, and then I wanted to ask a question based on my sharing. I have a youth advisory that's been operating with me for more than 5 years now, and these youth advisors have established their own working group on climate justice, and they work closely with other young people-led organizations that focus on sustainable development and climate issues. You mentioned this, I guess, as a goal for increasing youth engagement, but are there resources attached to this? Is there a program that is specific? Is there something that I can tell my youth advisors that they can plug into in order to help to grow this movement?
Thank you for that question, Senator McFedrin. It's an important one and one near and dear to my heart. I have a youth advisory group called My Two Daughters, and they remind me quite often of the frustrations that today's youth have regarding the legacy that the current and recent generations have left them. And what I found most interesting, with speaking with them and other youth, is the degree that they're just taking the ball and running with it. They're not waiting for a structure to be put in place and so on, although we should have that in terms of youth advisory groups like you've taken the initiative in doing yourself. But a lot of them are self-organizing and creating groups. I was helping with someone in terms of looking for job opportunities in the area, and I couldn't believe the number of youth-led organizations that have developed over the last year. It's a positive, but it's also a negative. The fact that they've had to fill that gap because the older generations have not done what they should have done in terms of protecting their interests. The younger generation is self-organizing and running with it. So I think we need to provide the opportunities for them to be heard, but I don't think we should overmanage it. I do want it to be as self-directed as possible in terms of the youth using their own voice and their own channels for raising their voice. As well as having channels into the traditional structures of society, like elected governments and the Senate and so on. So not a complete answer. It depends on the sector in terms of whether there's a specific youth organization that's been given standing to speak to the issue. One thing I can say is that just looking at the evolution of United Nations conferences, I felt like I was a youth as a university student at the Rio Convention in 1992. I was already in university, so I'm not sure I was, one of the youngest people there, but close to it. If you look at the more recent United Nations conferences, as well as side conferences or side events associated with those, you see the youth there. They're quite clearly present and often not that happy with what's going on. And I would encourage all of you to follow your lead, Senator, in finding ways to hear that voice directly from them and then giving effect to that voice.
There was an aspect to my question that you haven't answered, so I'll just hone in on it and ask whether you yourself, with the resources available to you, have used any of your resources to actually create a pathway for ongoing engagement and feedback from youth leaders.
It's interesting that you asked that, and apologies for not addressing that directly. As the newish commissioner, one of the things that I'm looking at is what forum I should use to have my own advisory body. So not just looking at things from a internal organization only. There was a former commissioners advisory panel many years ago, and it has gone into disuse over the last couple of years. Rather than just repopulating it with the typical complement of advisors, I would like to incorporate youth into that advisory structure that I'll be setting up. I don't currently have an advisory structure because I want to do it right, and I didn't want to rush into it and just replicate the previous one. But yes, definitely youth would be part of that.
Well, please don't hesitate to call on my youth advisors to spread the word. There's quite a network, and we'd be happy to get the word out when you're ready.
Absolutely. Thank you for that offer, and we'll make a note of that when it comes time to constitute and populate the advisory panel for the commissioner. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And now Senator Galvez.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. DeMarco, for this incredible work that your office is doing. Couldn't agree more with the 8 lessons that you draw from your work and your study of the situation. Hopefully I can pick on the fact that you are an umbrella looking at everything from above. And so you can see the interconnections that not necessarily the people that are down are looking at. As I'm sure you have concluded, is that one of the reasons because we don't get to our targets is because we act in silos. We are just in a tunnel and we just see this. And maybe you can help us in making the connections, especially with respect between, education, environment, finances, health. All these sectors are related. My specific question to you is, what is the role of science in this? Because science, the climate science is clear, and the climate targets are also backed up by strong science. And now scientists are saying, well, these are the roadmaps to get to net zero. You spoke about short-termism in politics, but please, when you address to us, have in mind that we are senators, that we are not supposed to think in short-termism, and we are there for the long term, and so we can do a more sustained push for these issues that you have painted at as really worrisome. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think the senators have an important role, institutional role in looking out for those whose interests may not be well addressed in traditional decision making, whether that's regional or future generations and so on. So I'm extremely pleased of the increased interest amongst the senators in this. And I think as an institution, very well placed to play that role in terms of speaking for those who don't typically have a strong voice in the decision making, or speaking for the future generations who have no voice. So very pleased to hear about that. The role of science, you mentioned that as well. And it's part of lesson number 5 in terms of increasing public awareness. We do need to have science-based decision making driving this. But I was also struck by one of the members of the IPCC last year who talked about the fact that she was starting to grow tired of just continuing to do more science about this when the basics of it were still not being acted on. And I share that frustration. I'm all for more research in this area, and we certainly need to address some very difficult issues, and the science will be necessary. But even the most basic issues of, the carbon balance and the carbon budget that our planet has are not being acted on properly. And there's a degree of frustration there. So we do need to have science as an important guiding source for decisions. It's not the only source, but it's a very important source. And being able to transmit messages that are science-based in a way that will appeal to everyone and not just scientists is also crucial. But I would say at this point, we do have enough to act on, enough science to act on the issue now, and we have had for some time. It's no longer the emerging issue that it was in 1988 at the Toronto Conference at the Atmosphere. but we'd have a shortage of decisions and actions that are based on science, and that needs to change.
Great. Thank you very much. Senator Marshall, and then I have after that Senator Lafreda, and then if there's time, I have a question.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. DeMarco. Your presentation was excellent, very well laid out, it was perfect. My question relates to the green technology, and I don't know if it's within your purview, but you might be able to comment on it. Do you think that green technology has developed to the extent whereby we can meet our emission targets? I live in Newfoundland and Labrador, so I'm always interested in reading issues about energy security. And I'm looking out the window today and we're getting freezing rain. So I wouldn't want to depend on solar power or even wind power today to heat the house. So do you think that technology has been developed to the extent that, we're going to meet our targets? Because, we haven't met those targets in the past. So, does that fall within your purview, or do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, excellent question. And the transition to a net zero future does require technological innovation, and government has an important role in fostering that. So we've heard that in some of the committee meetings this week on our emissions reduction fund report, as well as this report on climate change. Some legitimate questions with people frustrated by the amount of money going into fossil fuel subsidies, for example, as opposed to research and innovation on these new technologies. Because if they aren't feasible, as you mentioned, Senator Marshall, then it'll be a very tough transition rather than a just transition. We can't turn the off switch on one thing before we know that the on switch on something else is going to work. So the technology has been moving. Do we have enough to get to our 2030 targets immediately? I would say the technology will be different in 2030 than it is now. I'm not a futurist and I'm not able to predict exactly how that will be, but we need to invest in the research and development to get us there. There are some very promising, recent technologies, but they are not enough yet. And that's why the transition to net zero has a multi-decade timeline. If it were doable immediately, then the timeline would be sped up, obviously. So yeah, definitely a role for technology in that green transition, and a role for investing in those transition technologies and final technologies that will be enabling a net zero future. Critical importance.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lafreda.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Mr. DeMarco, for being here with us. I was reading a series of articles in the Wall Street Journal, and there's 4 actions that are necessary in order for globally to meet our targets, including Canada. And my question to you is, where should there be more focus? And there is a huge challenge, which I will share at the end. One is government action forces owners to leave the fuel in the ground, coal, oil, natural gas. 2, shareholders force companies to leave the fossil fuels in the ground. That's like philanthropy almost. 3 would be new technology solves the problem. And 4, consume less, obviously through taxes, inciting all to consume less. And the huge challenge that the Wall Street Journal came up with is that the investment required by 2050 to meet targets is $131 trillion, and to stop climate change by 2050. The world GDP is $85 trillion. So 1, I'd like to have your insight on that. And 2 is, where should there be more focus amongst the 4 clear actions that are required to meet our targets?
Sorry, my mute button wasn't working there. A lot there. Hopefully you can hear me now. Where to start on that one? The issues they almost seem overwhelming, and of course it is a global challenge, so it's not surprising that they almost seem overwhelming. But if I think each country and each jurisdiction does its part, we can get there. You spoke about the cost of the transition, and sometimes we might feel like it's too big of an effort. It seems overwhelming, and we might retreat from that and be satisfied with the status quo. But what I always like to remind people is that there is no, using the term in science, there is no null alternative anymore. I mean, if we don't do anything, the costs of inaction will likely exceed the cost of a just transition. So we're already getting a flavor for that in Canada over the last couple of decades in terms of the costs of inaction by the globe as a whole, in terms of the extreme weather and so on. So it's going to be a difficult transition one way or the other. Do we transition to a hotter and hotter planet and go through what it would be a very difficult transition with climate-related catastrophes, climate-related mass migrations of human populations, or do we invest in those transitions to a net zero economy? It's an immense challenge, but there is no null alternative. By default, if we don't do anything, we're forced into another scenario that's just as difficult. I would like to ask Ms. DaCosta. She does have one more. That was a high-level answer. Ms. DaCosta has one example of a practical policy approach that she thinks will help with that in terms of coordinating efforts. So, Ms. DaCosta.
And thank you for that. I just wanted to state that we're all in agreement. We have to fight climate change regardless of the cost. We just have to see the challenges ahead in order to see how we could best meet them. So.
Yeah, so thank you. Ms. DaCosta, do you want to talk about the national energy issue?
Yeah, yes, thank you, Jerry. I think I just wanted to point out that we do try to bring to light some of these issues in the report, and we do refer to the possibility of having a national energy strategy or national energy approach, keeping in mind that there's some jurisdictional issues of certain provinces have jurisdiction over their energy, but there's a way to maybe clarify the pathway to see what we will prioritize and what government should prioritize nationally, and to ease the transition, make the pathway a bit clearer.
And as someone was mentioning during the sound check before the official presentation started, we do need a reliable electricity system and a grid we can count on as a key component of the just transition, and we need to work through the jurisdictional issues to make that happen in Canada and elsewhere.
Great, that was me, and thank you very much. And also my colleague across the harbor. And Senator Corder, you have the last question here.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. DeMarco. That was just an excellent presentation. And I was really glad to see lesson number 7, enhanced collaboration, because certainly Stan and Mary have been working very hard to ensure that everybody in the Senate is included in their special presentations that we have, and you are certainly the latest and excellent. My question is related to your lesson number 2. The Canadian economy is still very dependent on fossil fuels, and I grew up in Cape Breton that was filled with coal mining and a steel plant that gave great puffs of iron ore smoke into the air, so that when you're driving in, you could smell it and you could see it. And the tar ponds where you crossed the bridge and you held your breath. And as my daughter said, well, didn't you think something was wrong, Mom? And it was just, well, that was just the way it was. And so Canada has made a promise to do away with to do away with fossil fuel subsidies. The challenge is, and I've been on the Energy Committee, and when legislation comes through, you almost hold your breath, because it's always a challenge. And Senator Galvez was chair of the committee when I was on it, and it's a struggle to get things through, because messaging is switched. So, for example, the promise to reduce or to do away with fossil fuel subsidies has the messages now that the government is doing away with the fossil fuel industry. So it's very easy to change a word or two, and the Canadian public, who may not be paying as much attention, they listen to the loudest voices sometimes. So we do need significant investment, and Senator Marshall was talking about that in the latest technologies, the reducing fossil fuels. And, in Nova Scotia, we've had a lot of people using solar energy and wind energy. And lo and behold, a month ago, the Power Corporation came out and said that they were going to start charging more to people who are on the grid from solar energy. So what did those kinds of decisions, and they have gone back on it, not fully, but they've at least said that they're going to delay it. But those kinds of decisions by governments, whether it's federal, provincial, really do harm to those who are trying to make decisions based on what's best for our environment. And it was Obama who said we're the first generation to be facing it, but if we don't do something, we're going to be the last generation who are able to make a difference. So we are that generation, the first and the last. So how do we overcome those kinds of things? At least public now, I think in Nova Scotia, for example, there was so much public outcry that the Power Corporation backed down on it. But they're the realities of what we're living in, the communities that we're living in.
Yes, excellent question, and thank you for the compliment on the presentation. I can't take credit for that. I delivered it, but I didn't develop it. So thank you to all my colleagues on the call here and others in our office who are excellent at developing the content in terms of our reports and then communicating it. I get the great pleasure of presenting a lot of this information, but it comes from them. So the issues of fossil fuel subsidies and so on, and Kim Leach, who's actually on the call and has been at the office for many years, did very important work on this issue and helped bring it to the fore in terms of our office's reports on fossil fuel subsidies under previous commissioners, and maybe Kim will jump in at the end of my answer to add something on this. I think one of the answers is actually listed on the answers to this difficulty balancing the emission-intensive sector issue in lesson number 2 and essentially lesson number 8 about long-term focus rather than short-termism, as was mentioned by one of your colleagues. We do need to have a plan for doing this, and we have a just transition audit underway to look at the early returns from a smaller but important just transition relating to coal, and that's already ongoing in Canada, both on the East Coast and in Western Canada in terms of phasing out coal and moving towards lower emission or zero emission industry. So we can't just leave communities or regions behind and say, oh well, you were dependent on this resource and you're out of luck now in this future that we're moving towards. There has to be what we call a just transition to do that, and government is extremely well placed to do that, to smooth out the problems, the regional and economic and social disparities that could result if we did an abrupt transition without those sorts of measures. So that's our best hope, is for government to take action on a just transition rather than leaving it to a Darwinian approach to have it sorted out that way, which would not be fair to anyone and wouldn't be in keeping with our commitments to leave no one behind under the United Nations 2030 agenda. So those are some thoughts on that. It's not going to be easy, but there have been transitions in the past. The coal one that's ongoing. I'm from southwestern Ontario, which was the original oil-producing region in Canada. Yes. People forget that, but it was a long time ago. But we still have towns that are named after that era. We're certainly no longer in the a little bit of production still, but not much, but mostly into other industries, or at least processing and manufacturing related to that.
Excuse me for being mean,
yeah.
but we're run out of, I'm sorry, run out of time.
Sorry about that. I went on and on.
No.
And maybe we can reach out and continue this conversation from our offices.
Yes,
okay.
And I'm going to just take it over here and wrap it up and say thank you very much to Mr. DeMarco and your team for the excellent presentation and for the work that you do. Thank you also to our teams, our staff, Liliane de la Larson, Jess Mace, Sarah Marquis, Amy and Megan and Lauren in Stan's office, also to our translators, our interpreters, and the technicians, the people who had to brave the hell that's going on in downtown Ottawa to bring this to us today. I want to thank them particularly. And thank you to all of our colleagues and your staff who are with us today. We're learning together in order to be better equipped to address this urgent matter of climate change through our jobs, but also in our lives as citizens of Canada and of the world. Our next event will be on February 23rd with Catherine Hayhoe, and she deals with that important issue of polarization and getting beyond polarization. So I hope everybody will join us, and see you all next week when Senate resumes. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. And thank you again to Mr. DeMarco and team. Bye.
Thank you, and bye, everyone.